Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. In each podcast episode, I interview an expert from the fields of psychology, wellbeing, leadership, parenting or high performance. I pick their brain to uncover what they know about living well, what tips do they have for you and I quiz them about how they applied their expertise in their own life. Join me as we discover simple, science-backed ways to live, learn, flourish, and fulfill your potential. Hello, and welcome back to the Potential Psychology Podcast. Ellen here, your host. And I'm thinking about time today. We all know that we only have the same 24 hours as Beyonce, although I'm kind of guessing that my average 24 hours don't look exactly like hers. And the implication of that, or kind of what that's suggesting, is that how we use those 24 hours determines whether we are as successful as Beyonce. Although, again, I'm a little bit doubtful about that too. But if we put success aside for a moment, how should we be using our 24 hours if we want to be happy and well? Do we pour our time into our work? Do we sacrifice sleep for exercise? What trade-offs do we make? Because we all know that you can't fit 30 hours into 24 hours, even if you are Beyonce. Does every 24 hours need to look roughly the same for happiness and well-being, or can it vary? And why do things tend to go pear-shaped health-wise on holidays? These are the questions that I'm putting to today's guest, Professor Tim Olds. And Tim is a time use epidemiologist, which he'll explain in a moment, and one of the incredible speakers at the upcoming Wellbeing Evidence and Horizons Conference, a 2-day science-based wellbeing event taking place in Melbourne at the Melbourne Exhibition and Conference Centre on the 28th and 29th of April 2020. Tim's presentation at the conference is titled How to Build Your Best Day. And thanks to our fantastic collaboration with the Wellbeing Evidence Horizons Conference for this season of the podcast, we're getting a sneak peek into his research, his knowledge and his wisdom on what best days look like and how to create yours. Let's have a listen. With me today is Tim Olds. Tim is a professor of behavioural epidemiology at the University of South Australia. And after completing a PhD in French studies at the University of Sydney, Tim went on to study exercise science, receiving a second PhD in 1997, as you do. His research interests have been in mathematical modelling of cycling performance, population and sports anthropometry, is that how I pronounce it?
Anthropometry.
Secular trends in the sleep, fitness, fatness, physical activity and food intake of children and adolescents, and the relationship between how people use their time and health. And that's a little of what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Ellen.
It's lovely to have you here. As I was just saying off air, I am in no way an expert in the sorts of things that you study, so I'm going to ask you lots of really basic questions. And the first one I have for you is just, what is behavioural epidemiology?
Oh, well, it's a fancy name, but essentially what interests me is how people use their time and how that affects their health. So how people use their time includes physical activity and sleep, sitting, cognitive behaviours like learning languages, doing crossword puzzles, social interactions and the like. And health is really everything from diabetes to depression, from anxiety to eczema.
Okay.
Full symphony of mental and physical health conditions.
Okay, so we're really looking at the links, I suppose, between, or perhaps the patterns between our behaviour, our everyday activities, all of those things that you just mentioned, and then what that may lead to in terms, or what it may tell us in terms of a whole lot of different health outcomes. Is that right?
Sure. The word patterns is really important because more and more, rather than looking at individual behaviours, as we did, I guess, until about 10, 15 years ago, we're looking at patterns of behaviours. So it's a bit like the changes happened with diet and nutrition. So previously we were interested to see whether fat was bad for health or nuts were good for health. Now we're looking at patterns of diet like the Mediterranean diet. So you might think of it as, we're trying to find the Mediterranean day. What we call it the Goldilocks day, the ideal day for overall health.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, isn't it? Because that is kind of a movement, I suppose, in how we understand health, is that it's beyond just trying to do one particular thing, like do eat this, don't eat that, for example, and really what is the wider system of things that we might be able to do that we know will help us to, say, live, learn and flourish.
Yes, that's absolutely right. In fact, it's taken us a very long time to realise a really obvious fact that there are only 24 hours in the day, and that if you increase the amount of time you spend doing one thing, say physical activity, you've got to decrease the amount of time you do something doing something else. And so it's never just one thing. You have to have a look at changes in patterns of behaviour. So if I want to spend a bit more time sleeping, what's going to go? Am I going to be less physically active? I'm going to reduce my screen time, my television viewing time. And the choices you make there can have very different effects on your health. And so that's the 24-hour movement, which has really begun to dominate my area over the last 5 years. But before that, we just really looked at individual behaviours and individual health outcomes. For example, is television viewing bad for depression? Is physical activity good for cardiovascular disease? But now we're looking at patterns of behaviour and patterns of disease as well.
Okay, well, that's kind of reassuring in a way. As a parent of primary school aged children with, 2 people in our household working full-time jobs and all of the things, you kind of know intuitively that you can't actually do all of the things that are, in inverted commas, prescribed to us in terms of keeping well. There has to be a compromise.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, we call it trade-offs. Yeah. So a lot of our work works on these trade-offs to say, well, to get the same benefit for, let's say, obesity as I would by doing 30 minutes of physical activity, how much more would I have to sleep? Because oddly, higher levels of sleep are associated with a lower risk of being obese. And it varies from person to person, but generally speaking, it's about 30 minutes of physical activity is equivalent to 1 hour of sleep. So you can either exercise another 30 minutes or sleep an extra 60. I'll take the sleep, thanks.
Okay, yes, I will too. And that's specific. So that's a finding that you've made in relation to mental health particularly, or is that overall health?
Not mental health. The outcome there, remember, is fatness.
Oh, okay, fatness, yep.
For different outcomes, those trade-offs are a little bit different. So it depends which outcome you're looking at.
Okay.
So we call these things equivalence trade-offs or equivalence curves.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just give you a couple of examples here. We did some work with retirees, and we wanted to see basically how much one would need to trade off to get an equivalent improvement in say, quality of life or something of that sort. So we had a look at the trade-off between, say, physical activity and sleep. So to get the same benefit for stress, the same reduction in stress that 20 minutes of physical activity would buy you, you would need to sleep for almost 2.5 hours more. Well, that's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just look at depression, it's quite different. So 20 minutes of physical activity is equivalent to about an hour of sleep. So it varies according to the outcome that you're looking at. It's not the same for all health outcomes.
Okay, so if I am struggling with depression and I have the option, I'm just trying to paraphrase to make sure I'm understanding, if we know from the studies that you've done and this epidemiological research that my options are, we know that sleep can improve stress and we know, or depression.
Physical activity is much more powerful for stress
Okay.
than sleep. But physical activity and sleep are roughly equal for, let's say a little bit of physical activity doesn't go as far for depression, and sleep's a slightly better option.
Okay, so if I'm stressed, I should do physical activity. But if I am struggling with depression, then sleep may do the trick.
Yeah, physical activity is still good for you in depression, but sleep's a little bit more powerful for depression than it is for stress, at least in this group of retirees. It's probably different for children or midlife adults. It varies from population to population. But the basic principle is we can trade off one thing against another. We also trade off good things against bad things. So, for example, if I reduce my physical activity by 20 minutes, how much would I have to increase my screen time, say, to have the same bad effect as that?
Okay. So we've got an awful lot of trade-offs in our day. So we're really looking at, what does the research, what do the patterns tell us about what these trade-offs are, so that is the goal ultimately to be able to inform or perhaps prescribe certain activities throughout the day or certain amounts of activity throughout the day, depending on what kind of health outcome we're looking for?
That's pretty much it, yeah. So ultimately what we'd like to do when we put all these outcomes together, and we have to weight them, obviously, some outcomes are more important for some people than others. But when we put them together and we get to one sort of, general outcome, what we'd like to say is this is the Goldilocks day. This is the ideal day to get ideal health in that particular mix that you want. And the closer you come to that day, the better. You don't have to achieve it, of course, but the closer you come to that day, the better. So say to someone, well, we can compare their current day with the Goldilocks day and say, look, you really need to get a bit more sleep, a bit more physical activity, and wind back the screen time. You get closer and closer to that sweet spot, that Goldilocks day. That's what we're after.
Okay, and then we may be able to use that as guidance for, say, the average adult, but also then start to look at particular needs of an individual who are struggling with particular health challenges.
That's right. It's like with all guidelines. So you have a simple guideline for the population as a whole, but we know that they differ according to population. So what's good for an 11-year-old child is obviously not good for a retiree, and what's good for an obese adult may not be what's good for a very lean adult. It all depends on where they start from and what their goals are, of course. If you're a lean adult, you're not particularly worried about obesity. That's not a major issue. But you may be worried about depression. If you're a child, you may be a parent of a child, you may be worried about academic performance. Academic performance is really interesting. It's very different from the others. For almost every other health outcome for kids, the prescription is pretty straightforward. They should get quite a bit of sleep. They should get lots of physical activity, and they shouldn't do much sitting.
Mm-hmm.
Or tragically, for academic, it's almost the opposite. That the less they sleep and the less physical active they are, the better. Because that sucks time from the study time, basically. So with academic performance, the strange thing is the only thing that really matters is what we call light physical activity, which is pottering around. And the less pottering around they do, the better. That seems really strange because what's wrong with pottering around? It just means light play or just hobbies and things like that. They seem okay. But the more of that they do, the worse their academic outcomes. And the reason is it sucks time from all those other things which are good for academic performance. Sitting there studying, getting enough sleep, getting a bit of physical activity. And so that's a good example, I think, of the new way of thinking of the 24-hour day.
And those trade-offs.
And those trade-offs, yeah.
Yeah. So that is interesting. I think this is, I'm a parent with, as I said, primary school age children, so we haven't sort of got to the pointy end of study yet. But as a parent, where does that kind of leave you? Because you then become responsible for those trade-offs, I suppose. Do I insist that the child sits and does their study for X amount of time at the sacrifice of their sporting activities or other things that we know are good for them in pursuit of higher academic achievement? Or do I prioritise their general well-being? That stuff gets tricky, doesn't it?
Very tricky. In fact, there's a recent study out by a guy called Fraudini from the United States, and he was looking at this is in older kids, about 14 to 15, the ideal amount of sleep they should get, one, for academic achievement, and secondly, for mental health. And the ideal amount of sleep for academic achievement was about 7.5 hours a night, and the ideal for mental health was 8 3/4 hours a night. So how do you weight them? Do you want a child who's doing brilliantly but more liable to be depressed? Or do you want a child who's, really mentally well but is not doing well at school?
Yeah.
It depends on how you weight those outcomes. What's important to you?
Yes. I know which one I'd do. I'd have the happier child.
I don't know. A lot of parents wouldn't.
Well, I know, and of course those things are shaped a lot by the environment that we're in as well, isn't it? The culture of the environment, perhaps family culture or school culture, or
I mean, like for Asian families, for example, success at school is extremely important. Culture is exceptionally important. So their decision may go another way for a more laid back, New Age hippie family, for example.
Yeah.
They're value decisions which people have to make. All we can do is to say the science tells us this is the relationship between the two. You make the decisions about from that point onwards.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what with me, my psychologist hat on, I'm thinking, well, really it comes down to your values and what's important to you, which of course then the extension of that is it comes down to even knowing what your values are, which is not something that we necessarily talk about widely either as a society.
No, and I think, a lot of people have values, but they haven't articulated them or thought about them. Actually, one of the good things about this is, when you have to make decisions, and parents are gatekeepers of activity in much the same way as they're gatekeepers of diet, when you are forced to think about and make those decisions, then that's good. You really have to question your values. Now, so far I've only talked about duration, how long things last, because there are other characteristics of behaviours as well which are important. So if you consider sleep, for example, and how long you sleep is important, but the quality of sleep is another thing. So it's the timing of sleep. So when do you go to bed and when do you get up? The variability of sleep. So do you go to bed every time the same night and get up every time the same morning? All of those things are important. And they, in many cases, are independently important. With sleep, for example, I've done a lot of work in sleep. The timing of sleep seems to be really, really important, just about as important as how long you sleep. And in every single study we've done with kids anyway, the best pattern is early to bed, early to rise. It's associated across the board with every good thing that can happen to a child. So what your grandmother told you was right.
That's going to really annoy my children when I tell them that.
When we have three, when you compare kids who get the same amount of sleep, but one's got an early to bed, early to rise pattern, another late to bed, late to rise pattern. It's the kids with the early to bed, early to rise who do so much better. We don't really know why, but I suspect that what's happening is that if they go to bed early, then they're not exposed to sitting up watching television, eating mindlessly, snacks and so forth. And if they get up early, they're more likely to have breakfast, they're more likely to be able to do something active before school, they have time to walk to school, for example. So it just lends itself to more physical activity and better diet. That pattern, there isn't anything magic about it. So I think it fits in better with a healthy world, healthy way of life, basically.
Okay, but that sort of answered my question, because I was going to say, what is early? Because obviously different families will have different concept of what's early, but maybe it's not so much about the actual time that kids go to bed, it's about how they're using that time at either end. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, kids, you'll know that kids sleep less and less each year. They lose about 12, 15 minutes of sleep each year until they reach adulthood. So what's early for a 8-year-old is obviously quite different what's early for a 16-year-old. There are norms that have been published now, averages. But on school days, I can tell you that almost every child gets up at 7:15 because that's how long it takes. Get them awake, get them dressed, get them fed, and get them off to school.
Yes. Well, that would be pretty consistent with our house, I think.
You should also, by the way, look at, I've spoken about characteristics of sleep, but the characteristics of other things as well. Like physical activity, for example. It doesn't matter where you do it in one long hit. It doesn't matter if I get 60 minutes a day, which is recommended for children, by the way, at least, or 6 10-minute hits. Does it really matter? And our work suggests it doesn't really matter, actually. Provided you get it. It's a similar sort of thing with adults, what they call the weekend warrior phenomenon. People who do nothing, and the weekend they go out and ride for 3 hours or something. And you get just basically the same sort of benefits.
Okay.
They do that. So that doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. Whereas in sitting, it seems to make a difference where you sit for a very long time, where you break it up. So you may get 2 people sit for 8 hours a day, and one will sit for 4 hours just watching television, and the other will, every 20 minutes, they'll get up and do something. That second pattern appears to be much healthier.
Okay. So for sleep, is it consistency? So do we have to kind of go to bed, get up the same?
That's a really good question. We call that sleep variability. And it's basically going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. And the evidence seems to be that people who have better consistency, who are very regular in their patterns, do better. That's certainly the case with kids, okay? It's called what they call the structured day hypothesis. Kids who have a very structured day do pretty well. And one of the things we've been looking at recently is school holidays, where, of course, structure goes out the window. And there have been a number of studies recently showing that the entire increase in fatness in kids occurs during the summer holidays. They should get leaner and leaner and leaner during the year. In the summer holidays, it shoots up. Then you get leaner and leaner and leaner again, not to the level they were previously, and it shoots up again. Over a number of years, the entire increase in fatness happens during the school holidays. We also find declines in fitness during the school holidays, and also, unsurprisingly, declines in reading ability, mathematics ability, and so forth. It used to be called summer learning loss. And one of the theoretical reasons behind this is that you don't have structured days and holidays. Where you've got structured days, when you think about a school, almost every child, whether you go to the wealthiest school, wealthiest private school, or the lowest public school, whether you're young or old, a boy or a girl, whether you're really bright or really dumb, you basically do the same thing. You sit in front of a teacher for an hour, you go out and play, come back and sit in front of a teacher for an hour, you go out and play, eat your lunch and so forth. Every child does the same thing. It's a great leveller. It's the most democratic of institutions when you think about it. But when they go to holidays, it's entirely different. There'll be kids who they'll go to their violin lessons and their tennis lessons, and they'll be eating their salad or whatever. The other kids who are sitting alone in front of the television, eating a counterpart and a hamburger, or playing video games. So it's at home that you get these big differences between kids. And one thing we find with the holidays is some kids do really well. They don't get fatter at all. They don't get less fit at all. They're the ones whose parents make them do things, and whereas kids typically from lower socioeconomic status homes, poorer homes, less educated homes, they go down, they get fatter rapidly, they get less fit rapidly. So the gap between them gets bigger and bigger and bigger with every summer holiday, and it's mainly, we think, due to lack of structure on those holiday days.
How fascinating! I know as a parent, well, certainly, you read anything about parenting, and they talk about the importance of routine, to establish sleep patterns and do all of those sorts of things. But I guess this is another layer on that, isn't it? That this structure is where we are establishing all of those things, the things that we use our time doing, whether it, the sleeping, the eating, the sitting. So having a bit of consciousness around how you're using your day rather than just allowing it to because it will just suck you into the vortex if we're not conscious.
Which is basically what happens on holidays. You have this sort of that timeless time of holidays where things just drift on endlessly, and may go down, have a drink, or may go to the beach for an hour or two. There's no structure to it at all. Seems great because it's been a holiday, but as a way of living, it's not a good option.
Okay, so we're allowed to punctuate the routine with these brief periods of holiday, but day to day, day in, day out, structure and routine around those key activities is going to be really important, according to the research, according to the studies on all of these different health outcomes.
Even I'm the most routinized person I know by a long shot, but even I occasionally need a break from it.
Tim, you talked about the Goldilocks day earlier, and this idea that we can come up with a kind of a guideline, or indeed at the individual level potentially a prescription for, how do we best structure our day to, and there's always going to be those trade-offs. So as you say, what might be good for stress isn't necessarily the ideal for depression, which isn't necessarily the ideal for academic performance. But if we had a general kind of rule, what should adults be doing? Let's start with the grown-ups.
Okay. I can tell you here because I've done work on this. For adults, generally speaking, and this is looking mainly across, what we call cardiometabolic markers, which are risks of heart disease and diabetes and stress and so forth. The best possible day that adults can get is a pretty wide range of sleep. It can be anywhere between 5.5 and 9 hours a night. They should get less than 9.5 hours of sitting. That includes both at work and at home, because you sit down to eat, you sit down when you're travelling and so forth. And all of the rest of the day should be some sort of physical activity. It doesn't mean running marathons or going to the gym, but just basically when you're on your feet and moving around. So there'd be 9 to 12 hours a day of physical activity, including light physical activity. And the worst possible day for them is when they get less than 6 hours a day sleep and less than 4 hours a day of total physical activity, which leaves about 13 hours a day for 14 hours a day for sitting.
Okay.
So it's characterised by very high levels of overall physical activity. Remember, it's just basically being on your feet. Enough sleep, So the recommended level for the National Sleep Foundation is 7 to 9 hours. But we find that people can function pretty well on less than that. But it's a general sort of range, and as little sitting as possible.
Okay. And I suppose that does really equate to that when you said, what the worst possible day looks like. That did sound a lot like particularly Christmas holidays, when we spend a lot of time perhaps eating too much and sitting around digesting and not doing a whole lot else. And then maybe the kind of bedtime procrastination where we just kind of keep scrolling through Netflix or doing whatever, so we're not getting enough sleep either.
Yeah.
So that's interesting as we approach that time of the year to think about, is this actually, or whilst that it may seem very appealing, especially while we're terribly busy in the lead up to Christmas, is it in fact what we ought to be doing, or should we be balancing our sitting with a good walk?
Yeah, I think we've got a tradition of long summer holidays, not as long as in the States. You get 10 to 12 weeks, or in Europe in many places, same thing, 10 to 12 weeks. That's a long time. And it's a long time to have roughly a fifth quarter of the year unstructured.
Yeah. And then the other flip side of that, so what we ought to be doing, what a Goldilocks day does look like for an adult, I think the sleep, there's a lot of information out there on sleep. We know probably that we ought to get our 7 to 9 hours, although interesting the degree of variation perhaps in that at the individual level. The sitting and the movement, that's interesting to me, because that sounds like, so you're saying 9 to 12 hours of standing or movement, that seems like
a lot, doesn't it?
A lot, that does seem like a lot.
It is within what we call the activity footprint, which is the actual mix that some people get. So some people do get that. But it's pretty difficult, I think, when you've got jobs like ours, basically sitting down a lot, working on a computer a lot. It's difficult when you do that. But it's probably not all that difficult especially with young children. They're constantly tidying up things and making meals and the shops and all that, all the logistics of getting a young child out of the door. There'd be some jobs, for example, nurses or shop assistants who could be on their feet for a very long time. But it is very difficult. The good news, however, is that if you do one of those jobs where you do a lot of sitting and you can't do much about it, you can actually pay your way out of that by doing some vigorous physical activity. So if you look at the vigorous physical activity people do, if they get above about 1.5 hours a day, and there's quite a lot of physical activity, and I'm not talking just walking here, I'm talking about running, riding, then that pretty much eliminates the negative effects of sitting. But there aren't many people in the population who day after day get 1.5 hours of pretty solid physical activity.
No. So that's going to work really well for those people who are heavily into their running, cycling, gym, for example. But for the majority of us, it might be around how we just increase that incidental exercise. And again, for productivity, you're far better off working for 40, 50 minutes, getting up, going for a walk, whether it's walking around the block or even just walking around your office or making, moving to a different level using the stairs or whatever it might be. That's good for your productivity and creativity, but also from the sounds of things, it's going to be better in terms of all of those health outcomes too.
Oh, I know about it. And there's a whole area now that's in designing buildings in such a way that people have to walk more. There's a redevelopment at Flinders University near us where they've literally designed a building so people have their mates, so instead of straight corridors, they've got curvy corridors with the toilets and the photocopiers like miles away from the desks. And people, you have to go up and down flights of stairs. And people are actually walking, taking 1,000 steps more each day. Now, given the average person takes about 8,000, maybe 9,000 steps a day, you've increased by over 10% just by changing the workplace environment. So just by little things like that, design features, you can make big changes to overall levels of physical activity. And then, of course, you make individual decisions, for example, cycling to work or getting off a couple of stops early and walking the next bit, or public transport always involves some walking.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so that's interesting. And I suppose that what we're saying there is this work that you're doing is starting to inform the decisions beyond just the individual level, but starting to inform decisions everywhere from an organisational level, I'm guessing then through to policy level.
Exactly, right through to policy level. I'm doing something for the South Australian government at the moment, and we're discussing things like shutting down the city streets once a month entirely, having market stalls on the streets and things like that. one really interesting thing that did a study some time ago was looking at the number of steps people took across the day. This was done 20 years ago, I think. And he found there's a really big spike on Thursdays. What's going on here? And it's just late night shopping.
Oh. So there you go. A bit of retail therapy is also good for your well-being.
Yeah, there's another couple of thousand steps just in late night shopping. When late night shopping on Thursday was a thing, it's late night shopping every night now. So, but it just shows you that a small change like that can really have a big impact on people's behaviours.
Yeah, which brings us back to those patterns, doesn't it? Where do we see those patterns? We might not have thought about a link between late night shopping and people's activity level without viewing the data and seeing, and then starting to question, what's going on here that people are walking more on Thursdays, and how might we use that information? So, Tim, we talked briefly then about the Goldilocks day for an adult. What does a Goldilocks day look like for a child or an adolescent? Because I know we have a lot of parents listening.
Yeah. For children, it'll vary, of course, by the age of the child. That makes a big difference there. Of course. Most of our work's been done on primary school age children. And apart from academic performance, which is really an outlier, everything else, the best thing is to get 9.5 to 11.5 hours sleep a night. And that's pretty close to what the National Sleep Foundation, the US National Sleep Foundation recommends. They recommend 9 to 11. We've found 9.5 to 11.5. They should have no more than 8 hours a day sitting. Bear in mind, a lot of that's school, and there's travel, and there's always spend about an hour in the meals. And, of course, there's TV. And the remainder of the day, which is about 5 to 7 hours, should be physical activity of all sorts. Now, the recommendation is that kids get at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is basically playing games and sports, and the rest would just be what we call light physical activity, which is pottering about and kicking, mucking around the backyard, that sort of thing.
Okay. So in actual fact, that is then, so there's less activity required for kids, but more sleep.
Yeah.
And the sitting's probably about the same.
Yeah. The sleep, of course, eats into it. There's a big difference in sleep there between maybe 11 hours for an 11-year-old and 7 or 8 hours for an adult. So, yeah, surprisingly, kids get more vigorous physical activity than adults, but the total amount of physical activity is probably greater for adults, mainly because kids are all sitting at school.
Yeah.
And then, they're very often sitting in the back of cars being taken to their sport.
Yes.
They sit at meals and so forth, much more than adults do. We're up and about, So they'll sit down and have the breakfast while we're stuffing around the kitchen trying to make the breakfast for them, So little things like that.
Mm. And from your research, and I don't know if it extends into this, but, are we getting this stuff right? Are the adults, both for themselves and also as gatekeepers for the children, are we getting this stuff right, or is there still a lot of room for improvement?
They're not getting it right, okay, because I mentioned what I called activity footprint, which is the area that people actually get. And some people get high levels of physical activity and low sleep, some get high sleep and high sitting and so forth. But these ones are what people actually get. We know that's what they get. Right? And then we look at, okay, what part of that footprint is ideal? It's right on the edge of it, right on the very edge of it. So only a small number of people live in that kind of coastal strip of the Goldilocks day. Most people are out there in the hinterlands, So there'll be very few who meet the ideals. I mean, we know that. We know, for example, just in terms of physical activity, only about 19% of kids get 60 minutes of physical activity on a daily basis. Adults, the demand's a bit less. It's recommended they get at least 30 minutes and about 50%, 5 times a week. So at least 50% of adults get that. Most kids get to sleep. It's not really a problem with the sleep, and a lot of adults don't. So we're far from, I think, the activity pattern which would get what most people want, which is cardiometabolic health, mental health, and so forth.
So, we touched on policy before, but what do we need to do you think? How are we going to use this fascinating research to help people move a little closer to that coastal strip, that zone where we're getting it right?
Well, look, in terms of what we call interventions, which is basically change people's behaviour, there's really two schools of thought. One is that it should be done at an individual level. You give people information, you give them incentives, you give them encouragement, you give them the tools and the freedom and the power to do it, empower them to do it. And the other is basically a sort of coercion model where you change the environment in such a way that they've got no choice. So if you close down the centre of the city, they've got to walk. If you impose $100 a day parking, restrictions, they won't bring their car in. And then in between is, this sort of idea of nudging, which is, a bit of a cost, doing a bit of a challenge. It's a bit more work to be lazy. And all of these have been tried, and there must be none of them are successful.
We haven't hit the sweet spot yet.
My bet is it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be a whole lot of different interventions at all levels just coming at you all the time. So it's a bit like, everyone wants to talk about smoking, but activity is much more complex than smoking. People have still got to do something with their time. It's a really, really complex thing. So I suspect that they're going to be a whole lot of it. Some things were very successful, like these ideas of closing down the city have been extremely successful around the world.
Yeah. Well, certainly, as psychologists, we know that our environment shapes so much of our behaviour and our experience. So, yes, if we can tweak the environment, again, whether that's a workplace environment, a school environment, a classroom, a city environment, then it seems logical to me that it would then start to change behaviour. There may be some unintended consequences somewhere along the line. I suppose that's something to take into consideration too.
We still don't know. We still really don't know how the environment affects activity patterns. But my suspicion is that one of the reasons why it is actually quite resilient to change is that there is quite a strong genetic determination, and because we don't really know the rather odd things in the environment which affect our patterns. But, for example, what's been done with pollution and sleeping, noise pollution, particularly light pollution, and sleeping. You think that'd have an effect. You would think that people who live in highly polluted zones for that noise and light pollution would have poorer sleep. I haven't kept up the literature on that, but not all studies find that.
Okay, so it is complicated on many levels, not just because people are complicated.
Yeah, it is complex. And, and the other thing too is humans evolved. There wasn't enough food around. And so in that sort of environment, it makes sense to move as little as possible and to eat as much as possible, because you're storing up for the bad times, basically. And so I think we do, or at least some of us, have this evolutionary and genetic tendency to be thrifty, to not waste energy, and to eat whenever energy comes your way, just to eat it. And that's a kind of gradient we work against. In a different environment where you really have to move to get your food, and when you get it, there's not much there anyway, that makes sense. It's a really good adaptive strategy. But in today's society, it's not a good strategy at all, because there's any amount of food around, you just have to go next door to get it.
Which, again, I suppose in some ways comes back to that environmental impact as well, doesn't it? That our society or our, just doesn't set us up for success necessarily, certainly not in these regards.
And it's kind of ironic that, when people talk about redesigning the environment to make people more active, they're actually redesigning the environment to make it less efficient. So it's more efficient to drive to work. But what we're trying to do, we're trying to make it as hard as possible. When we design kitchens with the famous triangle of the fridge, the bench, and the sink, to make people move as little as possible. But we should design to make people move as much as possible. It's less efficient, but it gets them moving.
Make it harder to get to the food.
Make it harder. Yeah, we've got sort of doors which open themselves, so we should have doors you need to push. We've got power motor mode, push motor mode.
Yeah.
We're designing activity out of the world for the sake of efficiency.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to those trade-offs that we spoke about earlier, isn't it? We're trading off efficiency of time. I know for me, consciousness around, I could get to work faster if I catch the bus, but I'll get my exercise in if I make the effort to walk. And then, of course, when I do that, I know that I'll be feeling better as a consequence and probably more productive when I start work. But it requires a level of consciousness around all of that. It requires intention, and what you're able to do with the work that you're doing is actually inform us around some of that stuff, give us that knowledge, that data, to be able to then make informed decisions and have consciousness around how we use our day.
Of course, there are, say you've got young children, so you have to drop them off to school, then you have to get to work, so it just may not be possible for you to do that. And then we need 2 cars because we've got, one in primary school, one in secondary school, one's doing the tennis lessons, one's doing the Mandarin classes or something, and on it goes. So your individual situation will very much determine just what's possible in terms of reshuffling the Lego blocks of your day.
But ideally, we need to work towards the Goldilocks day.
Yeah, I think that's really what we want. I'd like in the next few years to say, look, for most people, this is the ideal day. And the closer you can get to it, the better. Now, there are many ways of doing it, many ways. You can make these trade-offs or those trade-offs. But if your day looks something like this, then you're probably going to be about as good as you can be. And, lifestyle is incredibly powerful. It's more powerful than any drug, probably more powerful than all drugs put together. Because these small changes with sleep and physical activity have a massive influence on people's health and well-being. Just 30 minutes a day of physical activity reduces the risk of death at any given age by about 15%. And 60 minutes reduces by about 30%. 30% less likely to die in any given age. It's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. The incredible power of lifestyle medicine.
Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today. It's really fascinating stuff. And again, often, one of the things I love about doing this podcast is I get to speak to people who just inform me and all of our listeners about things that we have control over, we have power over, that can make such a big difference to our lives, and yet we may not necessarily have been exposed to or given a certain degree of thought, and you've really opened my eyes up to some of those possibilities today.
Thanks, Ellen. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Thank you. And our listeners can see you speak. You will be speaking at the Wellbeing Evidence and Horizons Conference in Melbourne in April 2020. That is right, is it not?
That's right. Certainly, the conference will be a really interesting conference. It's not just me, obviously. It's a whole lot of people with a whole lot of different perspectives on wellbeing.
Yep, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you again today for your time, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Ellen.
How fascinating was that conversation? That was Professor Tim Old, who will be speaking about creating your best day at the Wellbeing Evidence and Horizons Conference in Melbourne in April 2020. And I'm constantly amazed and fascinated by the array of work done by the wonderful guests that I get to talk to here on the podcast. I didn't even know, and perhaps you didn't either, that time use epidemiology was a thing. And now I've had the chance to talk to an expert in the field about how we spend our days and the impact of that on our health and our well-being for almost an hour. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you'd like a transcript of today's conversation, or you'd like to find out more about Tim and his work, you'll find all the links you need in the show notes for this episode. Visit potential.com.au/podcast. You can, of course, also find out more about Tim via his speaker profile for the Wellbeing Evidence and Horizons Conference, our partners for this season of the show. We have a link to his profile in the show notes, but you can also go direct to weh.org.au. There you'll also find out more about the Wellbeing Evidence and Horizons Conference, the other fantastic speakers, the run sheet for the 2-day event, and of course that's where you can register. Early bird registration is available until the 28th of February 2020. Now, next week, I get to pop over to Hawaii. No, not quite. My guest will be in Hawaii. I'll be here in Ballarat, but I'm very excited to be talking to her. She is Dr. Sarah Sarkis. She is a psychologist, a writer, and performance consultant. She is a bundle of energy and enthusiasm with a wealth of experience in mental health and wellbeing. And we're going to be talking about how we deal with the struggles and the suffering in our lives, because we all have patches, no matter how well we're thriving and flourishing and functioning. When life is hard, things happen and it's not easy. So what do we do then? How do we survive and how do we thrive? What can we learn, and how do we not just bounce back from those periods, but perhaps bounce forward and come out the other side a little bit stronger? Here's Sarah to tell you more.
Resiliency and grit, toughness, tenacity atrophies when we rely too much on avoiding our pain. And listen, sometimes you got to assess your life. You got 3 kids at home, husband walked out or died. You got to get up in the morning. I'm thinking denial's a decent choice. Like, I'm thinking a little bit of use of avoidance here and there. So, this is scaled to your life and the time you're in. And our defense mechanisms sort of work for us until they don't. And when they've outlived their usefulness, it becomes obvious in the way that we feel. Trying to skip or fast forward or numb any of our experiences has a cost.
That's next week on the Potential Psychology podcast. It's going to be a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to being back with you then. But in the meantime, stay safe, go forth and thrive, flourish and fulfill your potential.